Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Ema Sullivan-Bissett, reader in philosophy at University of Birmingham, and we're talking about her book, Irrationality. Dr. Sullivan-Bissett, wonderful to see you today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
So tell me, why this book? I mean, it's not like Irrationality ever really goes out of style. So, I mean, there's some immediate application. But what led you to this, and why do you think that even like these Cambridge Elements series, it makes it short, it's to the point? What is kind of your goal with the book, and why this book?
Yeah, well, the quick and honest answer, and I'll give you a slightly longer and more interesting answer, is that I didn't choose the book kind of chose me, right? So the Cambridge Elements are split into subdisciplines, and I was asked by the commissioning editor in the Philosophy of Mind series to write the element on irrationality. But I think that he was right that there needed to be a book of that kind in the Philosophy of Mind series, right? So the idea of irrationality turns up in lots of philosophical debates in philosophy of mind and epistemology. But I think more broadly, and maybe more importantly, non-philosophers and non-academics have something like the concept of irrationality already, right? And use it in their everyday lives. It's not a kind of concept locked away in the ivory tower. We reach for this all the time. So it's quite important to understand what it is that we're doing. And I think in light of that, like, there's two ways that I could have approached it. So I could have really interrogated the very idea of irrationality or a perfectly rational being or how we might do better as rational agents. But I didn't do that. Instead, I wanted to say, like, here's a bunch of stuff which is standardly taken to be irrational. What's going on in these cases? Are they irrational? If so, why? What more might we say about these cases? And I just hope that, as a goal of the book, I hope that readers might be encouraged to like a fuller understanding of some of those seemingly irrational parts of our minds and lives, which might otherwise just be kind of dismissed. I think there's a lot of rich and interesting ground
there. So talk to me about, let's go in that direction. What is some of that rich and interesting ground where, in regards to irrationality?
Yeah, I mean, so that's the kind of question that I interrogate when I'm talking about all the different kinds of irrationality. But, you might just think, if I have a partner who is clearly unfaithful, right? Everybody in the world can see that he's unfaithful, but I nevertheless find myself believing that he's faithful, right? Now, you might just say, you're irrational, you might just dismiss me as somebody worth having a conversation with. But once we dig in and think about what's going on, right, we can see that actually I've formed a belief which is not properly responsive to the evidence. The evidence is very clear. All my friends are telling me that he's clearly enjoying himself elsewhere. But nevertheless, there's something interesting going on because, my desire that he be faithful is kind of directing my attention to the sliver of evidence that he is in fact faithful and things like that. And I think that once we dig deeper into the mechanics of states of mind or behaviors that we judge to be irrational, there's some really interesting things to learn about how human beings actually work.
Can you talk more how do human beings actually work? And, and I'm sure that'll bring us around to debates about like the goal of saying things like rational, but.
Yeah, right. So, it's really standard in philosophy to think of beliefs as the kind of things which, are related to truth in some way. They're about accurately representing the world. They should respond to evidence and counter evidence. But when you look at cases of irrationality, what you learn is, on the surface, you learn that not all cases are like that, and that's interesting, right? So the case of self-deception is like that. But what you also learn is the ways in which that's achieved, right? So the self-deception case is one where it's typically thought that what's going on is someone has a very strong desire for something to be true. I just really want it to be the case that my partner is faithful to me, right? And that strong desire, and the stories will differ in the details, but that somehow changes my relationship to evidence and the way in which I form beliefs about that subject. And I think that's really interesting to learn that although we think beliefs are the kinds of things which kind of help us get around our environment, they represent the world as it really is, sometimes other stuff can be going on such that that's not the whole story, right? Sometimes your emotions can kind of get in the way. Your desire for something to be true changes the way that you interact with the world and the evidence in support of your beliefs. And you can say other sorts of things about other kinds of cases, but I think once you dig into the details of the cases, you see kind of that the human mind is pretty messy, and doesn't really bend to the idea that, you know, beliefs are irrational and respond to the world and so on. So once you kind of open the hood on all of these cases, you see the kind of thing that we're capable of.
Yeah. And let me ask you this. This is a little bit of an maybe a rabbit trail. If it's not a good question, feel free to ignore it. But when we talk about our desires shaping our beliefs, is there almost a conflict of human kind of mental powers? Because we do use our desires to shape the world, and sometimes that works, right? Like through our desires, they can shape the world. So it's almost like you have two powers interacting, conflicting with each other in some cases. Is that a little bit what's happening here?
Yeah, I think so. What's interesting about cases where your desires look to be having an influence is that they kind of have to do it undercover, right? So most people think that beliefs are not the kinds of things that can respond to your desires. So I want to believe that I'm the best philosopher in the world. I'd love to believe that. That would make me super happy, right? And I'd love it for it to be true. But I can't form that belief on the basis of that desire, right? Beliefs are just not the kinds of things which can be formed in response to your desires. But you might think that doesn't sit very well with what I just said about self-deception, right? I really want it to be the case that my partner is faithful. But what's going on there is I don't recognize that I have the desire and then directly form the belief on its basis. Rather, that desire is kind of working undercover to make me attend to particular kinds of evidence, ignore other kinds of evidence. So all this is because most people think, at least, that belief is not the kind of thing that is under our control in that way. It's not the kind of thing that can respond to how we desire the world to be. It can only respond to how we take the world to be.
So when I say desire shaping, not desire shaping beliefs, or I'm talking about desire shaping states of the world, right? Like for instance, when you talk about first starting a business, you kind of have to believe that you can be a businessman or businesswoman in order to, like, if you don't believe, then you carry yourself differently, and your business will fail. On the other hand, you don't know whether it's going to work out or not. like the belief comes after, or the states, the knowledge states come after we find out from the states, like, things are changing, right? Like when you're first starting out a business, are you successful or not? We don't know, but you have to act like you're going to succeed. Whereas with some of these, it seems like you're looking backwards, like and you're not responding to things that have already happened. Does that make sense? Like, I mean, when you talk about the faithfulness thing, it's like, no, he is faithful. It's like, well, okay. You can get into a relationship with someone and be like, he's going to be faithful, and that is like, you're looking towards the future. But when you have like all this evidence behind you, it's like, oh, that doesn't work anymore. Like, like it's already happened, right? It's like, I'm a successful businessman. I have 5 failed businesses. You're like, that's not how that works, right? Like,
yeah, well, you'd be surprised, actually. So I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, that's the irrational part, right? Yeah, but yeah.
Right, yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I mean, I think you're definitely onto something that, in order to pursue particular kinds of desires, you have to have the right kind of background beliefs, right? I would never pursue the desire to run 10K in 30 minutes. I know I can't do that, right? I'm never going to have the desire to do that. I'm not going to try to do that. But I might pursue the desire to write a book this year because, I do believe that that's something that I'm capable of. So I think that's right. But what you said about somebody couldn't, possibly believe that they're a successful businessman when they've got 5 businesses, I'm afraid you've overestimated people there.
I right? Rationally believe. Yes, yeah. Excuse me. Rationally. Yeah. No, I know people do. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's all sorts of stories you can tell, right? The world is against me. I was too early. This product is kind of beyond its time, or something. There are all sorts of stories that people can tell, and that people do tell, right? There's almost no amount of evidence that would persuade everybody of a particular kind of thing. So, and I think that's fascinating. The power of the human mind to believe stuff which is clearly and obviously not true, right? That's fun.
And we're not laughing. I feel like the truth is we're not really even just laughing at everybody else. It's such a human thing to do. Like we have caught ourselves everybody has caught themselves doing these things. Like it's a very human thing.
Absolutely. And it would really, and I hope this is kind of clear in the book, that it would really be a mistake for anybody to read it and think, not me though. Like I'm right. The exception, right?
That would be irrational. Yes.
Right. I would never be self-deceived. I would never believe a conspiracy theory, because actually once you look at the mechanics of how these things might be working, I think we're all really vulnerable to making these kinds of mistakes, right? So yeah, this is a book about humans, not a particular kind of human. It's all of us.
Oh, there's a couple different ways we can go, but and I should have asked beforehand how to pronounce this, so my apologies. And this is such a weird time to do it, but I should have asked beforehand. Did I say your name right?
No.
Yeah, okay. How do you say your name? My apologies. I should have. I was like, as soon as I said it. So how do you say your name? My apologies.
It's Bissett, not Bissett.
Dr. Sullivan-Bissett. My apologies. So that just slipped my mind. I normally ask that before I get on and record myself. So
sorry, my family will enjoy that.
Oh, I'm glad.
That's the kind of posher version of my name, Bissett.
Yeah, that's it's like Deleuze instead of Deleuze, or like if you want to.
Yeah, I am the Deleuze for sure.
Yeah. So how do you pronounce? Is it akrasia? How do you?
Yeah, that'll do. Yeah, akrasia.
Oh, of course, I got that one right. Okay, that's sure. That one I could have gotten wrong. Okay, that's a fascinating one to me, and I mean this idea. And you also say that in the literature there is a lot of work done to keep the notions separate, but you start out by saying weakness of will. Can you tell us a little bit about what akrasia is, and maybe give us a everyday example? I immediately thought of just staying in all day on my phone, but that might just be a little too much leaning into the weakness of will. I don't know. So what is akrasia?
Yeah, I think your example is probably a good one, depending on the details. But this was a real learning curve for me, because when I was asked to write the book, I knew basically nothing about akrasia, so I had to actually go and learn it. And I was very pleased to make the main character of that material a businessman called Fred, obsessed with his new suit. That amused me because I have a toddler called Fred now. I had a baby at the time, and I rather enjoyed imagining him in that role. But akrasia is typically understood as acting against one's better judgment. And that might sound a bit technical. And actually, when you look at the philosophical accounts of akrasia, like what makes an action acratic, things do get technical quite quickly. But I also think that it's a really easily recognizable phenomenon, right? So I think your example's a good one, but my go-to example is you're watching TV, you know full well it's 11 p.m. You judge that you should really go to bed, right? It's best for you to go to bed. You've got work in the morning. Your toddler will be up at 6 a.m. I'm not at all speaking from experience.
No, not at all. Yeah. I will be honest. This actually is making me uncomfortable, because it's putting me in the state of mind where I'm like, I start feeling guilty because I'm like, this is so stupid, but I'm just sitting here and I don't want to get up. Like,
right, exactly. Right. So, the information about your situation is not hidden from you. You clear-sightedly judge, I really, really should go to bed. But you don't, right? And you just stay on the sofa watching the next episode of that box set. You just fail to move. And so those are the kinds of cases that people have in mind when they think about akrasia. And I think those are interesting, because before you really think about it, you might just think, look, if it's really the case that you have judged that the best thing for you to do is to go to bed, how is it even possible that you don't? Right? How does that even come about? If you really think that's the best thing for you to do, how do you fail to do it? Right? And that's really the interesting question.
Yeah. Is there a communal side to that too? I am, again, definitely not talking from experience, where my wife and I are sitting there and one of the kids starts crying and we look at each other like, we should get up. One of us should get up and do you know, like, I should get up and deal with that, right? I should get up and deal with that, but look at
Yeah.
and then my wife looks, she's like, I don't want to. And I look at her and I go, I don't want to either.
Yeah. That's interesting. I've not thought about those cases. I wonder, yeah, I think one thing that you might say about those cases is that whatever it is that's making you ignore your better judgment is kind of made easier when your partner's also ignoring it too. Like, there's a kind of sense
it's
of,
so true.
right? There's a bit of camaraderie about it. You know, it's like, should I open a bottle of wine? Oh, I don't want any, or I won't bother then. But if he's having some too, like, well,
yes, yeah,
that's really a thing. So I think that, yeah, whatever it is that's making you ignore your better judgment, I can imagine that kind of stands up and puffs its chest out much more easily when you've got a bad influence on your shoulder doing the same thing.
So as we approach irrationality, what are some common misconceptions that people have about irrationality?
Yeah, good. I think it's actually quite hard to say how people think in general about irrationality. And maybe that's because of something I said earlier, that it's a concept with quite wide currency, right? So it's not something that's just talked about in philosophy classrooms or universities. It's something that I think most people quite easily reach for and kind of have a sense of what is meant. But maybe one thing that people might be tempted to is the thought that, like, irrationality, whatever it is not something I want in my life, right? It's a bad thing. And they might think that mental states or actions which exhibit it are in some sense like bad mental states or actions and the kinds of things that we should just want less of. And I guess I'm not sure I'd go as far as to say that's a misconception, but I think it's a bit uncharitable. It's a bit quick. It kind of fails to really pay attention to the complexity of irrationality. Like, yeah, so if we really want to understand more about human cognition and agency, I don't think it helps us to identify something as irrational and just think that's the end of the story, right? So sometimes we get that judgment wrong, but even if we don't, and even if we're right that something's irrational, I think paying attention to the wider context of cases can be much more illuminating than simply thinking these things are bad, be gone with them. Irrationality is not something I want, right? So yeah, I guess something I said earlier, I just sort of a slightly more nuanced approach to understand that it can be much more complicated than the concept of irrationality can tell the story of.
Yeah, I love it. You kind of hinted at it there that you talked about being uncharitable, and because it's such a snap judgment, it's an end of discussion type term. It's like, well, that's irrational, and you stop the discussion.
Yeah.
It encourages uncharitable and ungracious behavior when we recognize that it is a very human thing to be irrational and to listen more, to get that wider, but also just to, in general, have a more gracious and charitable approach. I think it's just a great application, right? I think, there's a rationality, there's a rational, and then I think, and I could be wrong here, but when you talk about that wider currency, I think another word that pops up a lot is unreasonable, right? And that's a conversation ending word too. It's like there's some maybe some gendered things there going on too, where it's like, oh, she's just unreasonable, and you can say, it's like that's something that people do to end the conversation and make a judgment and kind of move on, and not to see the other person. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think unreasonable, particularly more than irrational. And maybe that's just a kind of an artifact of the culture. But saying that really just means you're not a worthy interlocutor. You're not credible. You're not somebody with whom it is worth me engaging because you cannot engage in rational ways. And people will say that about, conspiracy theorists, for example.
Yeah.
And I mean, I do think that there's irrationality here, but dismissal is not the way to change minds. And I don't think that the assumption that minds cannot be changed is a good one.
But there's a contextual thing here too. Like I even as I was saying it, like in certain contexts, sometimes unreasonable, you're like, okay, you're being unreasonable can be useful, right? Like, especially at a more personal level, as children, I'm parenting my kids. It's like, you can't, that's unreasonable. And like children don't need a long explanation. They're not there for a long explanation. And without saying like, oh, that's bad, right? It's like, that's unreasonable, right? When they're like, for instance, and we can get into ideas of property and that gets really, in our cultures, it's a very touchy subject. But like a child has a ball and it's their ball and they refuse to play with the other kids with it. And it's like, well, you have, in our culture, you have that right, but it's unreasonable, and I think that,
yeah. Okay. You've met my son, I think.
Yes, I know, right? Like every kid ever, right? It's like, you're like, and that's that. So there are good uses for this term, especially when it's not deep seated, right? And there's a pedagogical use for it. Like when you talk about, you're talking about dismissal, dismissing something pretty light, or where there is some social pressure to like, they just need to be like, oh, that doesn't make sense. I think that can work. But then you have, you're talking about conspiracy theorists, dismissal in that sense, it just entrenches it, right? And so,
yeah. But I think you're right. Yeah, it can be a kind of call to action, right? So if my partner says to me, when we're watching politics or something, and I kind of, I don't know, dismiss what the right-wing pundit says out of hand, and he says, come on, you're being unreasonable, right? That could be a call for me to say, okay, quite right, let's take this slightly more seriously. So yeah, I can see how that can be a call for action, and particularly with children too. Like, you're not playing the rules of the game here. You're not contributing in the way that I expect you to. Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about akrasia, and then what is strange belief? Since you mentioned, you mentioned conspiracy theories, I thought that'd be the appropriate place to go next.
That's a perfect segue.
Yeah. So, and I kind of love that idea because it does. A conspiracy theory, one, can sometimes be true, whereas strange belief, by definition, is it allowed to be true at all? Like, it seems to be that it's, we're talking about when someone has a belief that is untrue and holding to it. Is that the right way to think about that, or I get that wrong?
No, so firstly, so you're picking up there on one of the title of one of the subsections in the book, but I don't take strange belief to be a technical term. I'm just using it to capture cases which kind of might be of interest, which might be irrational. But I understand that in terms of like rationality constraints that they're breaking. And actually, all of the cases that I discuss are usually false, but they don't have to be. So that doesn't have to be part and parcel of the picture. So I do self-deception, delusion, and conspiracy theories. But you're quite right. Sometimes conspiracy theories are true. It's slightly more difficult to tell a story about self-deception and delusional cases being true, but they're possible. So that wouldn't be part of the package.
Yeah, is this the part of the program where you come out as a flat earther? Is that the? That's like actually, yeah. Save it for the big reveal. And you also have implicit bias, and I think this one can be a little bit of a hot potato as well. I mean, nobody likes being called unreasonable. Well, again, maybe most people don't like being called unreasonable. But I feel like implicit bias, because it's this idea of hidden, that really frustrates people when it's pointed out. So, what is implicit bias, and what are some common misconceptions about it?
Yeah, okay. There are lots of misconceptions. So you just stop me if I go on too long.
Oh, no, please. Yeah, I'm excited.
Slight hobby horse of mine. The what is implicit bias question is actually a much, much more difficult question than it sounds. And I don't even try and answer that in the book because there's a whole philosophical literature on what this thing is. So I tried to stay reasonably non-committal about it. And I think you can have a discussion of implicit bias and rationality without really figuring out what the thing actually is. But when researchers talk about implicit bias, they're talking about like whatever it is in the head that has a distorting influence on the way in which you behave and the judgments that you make, right? So the most commonly discussed cases are ones of people who like sincerely express egalitarian beliefs, but they judge or they behave in ways that like don't look consistent with those beliefs, right? So I might believe that men and women are equally good at philosophy, but when I'm teaching and a woman in my class makes a really sophisticated philosophical point, I find myself a bit surprised by that. Whereas I wouldn't be if a man made the point, right? And the idea is that you can't explain why I'm surprised by appeal to any belief that I have, right? Because I've just told you that I believe that men and women are equally good at philosophy, right? So what's going on? And one story you might tell instead is that I have an implicit bias regarding philosophy and which individuals are good at it. So that's the kind of thing that we're thinking about. And there's lots of cases. There are hotter potatoes in this area. So, I might be more likely to interpret the behavior, the kind of benign behavior of a black man as quite aggressive, but I would think no such thing if a white man engaged in that behavior, right? And again, you're not going to figure out what's going on there by appeal to my beliefs. I don't think black men are more aggressive than white men, and yet something's going on here. Or I might walk into a science lecture and assume that the woman on the stage is the waiter or is there to introduce the scientist rather than the scientist herself, right? So these kinds of snap judgments that I'm making can't be explained by my beliefs because I have good egalitarian beliefs. So what do we do? And the idea is that there's an implicit bias which is kind of guiding these judgments. So that's kind of roughly what it is. I can talk about misconceptions if you would like.
Yeah. Well, before we get to the misconceptions, more about the misconceptions part, particularly, and there's so many different contexts where this conversation happens, and I think what we've kind of already touched on this in regards to rationality. How can we have more gracious and charitable? What are some ways to talk to people about implicit bias that encourages charitable and gracious conversations?
I sort of wish I knew. Because people do get upset, and I completely understand that, right? So, and this was one of the misconceptions that I was going to mention. Like,
yes, please.
Like the most obvious one is the idea that if you've got that kind of right kind of beliefs, if you don't have beliefs which are sexist and racist and ableist, then you're in the clear, right? And that's a really tempting and comforting thought, right? That's going to keep you warm at night thinking that about yourself. Especially if you think of yourself and pride yourself on kind of caring about fairness and equality. But like, I'm really sorry to tell you, it's false, right? So basically all of us have biases of this kind. And I mean, maybe that's the way in, right? So when we talk about bias, it's not accusatory. I'm not calling you kind of cognitively lazy for not having sorted this problem out that you've got in the head. I actually think that if you think about the causes of bias, which is kind of the environment that we all live in, then it's a shared problem. It's a problem we all have, regardless of our best intentions and our explicit beliefs. So that's the kind of only way in, I think, to just make it a problem that is shared, not a problem that is just a problem for, white men, for example.
I love that you said that, because I just had Dr. Shumita Dasgupta on, and she talked about the biological side of bias. And one of the ways she opened up the introduction to her book was talking about her taking, she's a woman of color in a STEM field. She teaches and does practices medicine. And she took the implicit bias test. Yeah, association. Yes. and she found that she had a bias against women of color in STEM. And she said it was mortifying for her, but the fact that she shared that story first really kind of opens the way, right? And I think that's, I love that you said that. Like, because when I read that, it really helped me like lower my guard, right? And I want to come with my guard lowered, but you're like, you're just waiting for like, am I going to get called racist or ableist in the middle of this conversation? And it's like, it doesn't feel good, right?
No, exactly. Actually, I had a similar experience. I took a implicit association test to do with women and careers, and apparently I find it very difficult to imagine that women could have careers, like, as a woman with a career. So it's quite humbling. Those kinds of cases are good ones to start with, because it just really demonstrates that this is a shared problem.
Which means we can have a shared solution too, right? And I think that's which is kind of what we need. Like, it's not like putting all the onus on just like one person. It's like, even the idea that like we should have, I think, state kind of interventions at certain points, but be like, if we have this one state intervention, then this problem will go away. And it's like, no, it doesn't work that way. We have to. This is something we work on together, and cooperation in general is
Yeah, and not just work on together, but work on systematically. It's not the kind of thing you can train yourselves out of in half an hour, which is kind of another one of the misconceptions, right? So you will often see people talk of implicit bias training, and that word really rather gives the impression that one can train away one's biases, right? If you go to a corporate 45-minute session on implicit bias and voila, like you're cured, it's fine. I think there's a place for training, although I wouldn't use that word loosely conceived, but I also worry that when we talk about training and we market it in that way, it can lead to a bit of complacency, but like, tick that box, problem solved.
Like, it kind of gives this idea of like almost going to the gym, like you get implicit bias reps. It's like, that's not doesn't work that way. If you don't mind, I'd love to ask a little bit more about kind of the structures that you talk about. Not the structures. You have a couple of these, like the difference between epistemic and practical rationality. Do you mind talking through that a little bit? Because I think too that helps us see. There's the ivory tower, which should exist discussions, and then there's like on the ground kind of discussions. Can you talk a little bit about epistemic and rationality? Epistemic and practical rationality.
Yeah, it's funny you heard it in the way that you heard it, because actually both sides of that distinction are kind of ivory tower, right? So the distinction is really about what the thing that is being judged as rational or irrational is. So epistemic rationality has to do with our mental lives, right? Most obviously beliefs. So it will track things like whether your beliefs are consistent, whether they're responsive to evidence, and so on. But practical rationality is not about, not being in a university setting. It's just about action in general, right? So maybe whether your actions align with your goals and so on. So the book caters for both. So epistemic rationality is like the strange belief stuff. And practical rationality is the akrasia stuff. Right, because akrasia is about acting in ways that are against your better judgment. So,
and how would you go about applying the two different kinds? It seems like for instance, like people can believe in flat Earth, and still live relatively normal lives, right? Until it sort of pops up generally. And so, whereas like if you have akrasia, it seems like that would, how does that flesh itself out on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose, yeah, the practical rationality is kind of much more noticeable to an observer, right? Whereas I can have all sorts of strange beliefs, and as long as I don't express them, as long as I don't tell anybody, you wouldn't know. I hadn't thought about it like that, but epistemic rationality is typically thought to be like something that, it doesn't matter how you behave. If you believe that 7 plus 3 is 12, it doesn't matter that you never express it. It doesn't matter that it doesn't affect any of your actions. Something has gone wrong here, right? You have failed to properly respond to the evidence, or you've failed to be coherent or something. Whereas I guess practical rationality is much more holistic in that it's looking at the way in which your mental lives, like your judgment about what you should do, interacts with your physical life, how you move around in the world. So the epistemic stuff's kind of much more contained, like in the head. The practical stuff is really about the relationship between what's in the head and what you go on to do.
Would it be fair, and this is a strange example, so maybe this doesn't work, but it kind of feels like in some ways epistemic rationality is like a warning light in your car that something could go wrong. And whereas like practical rationality is like you have a leak, right? Like this is something that, because what, like, you're like, if you do have it, it's not necessarily that anything is going to go wrong, but it is a warning sign that there might be something going on in your thought processes if you have, for instance, a strange belief.
Yeah, that's true. Especially if you, like I do, think that beliefs are at base the kinds of things which help you navigate the environment. They guide you around the world, right? So, maybe I've got a really kind of innocuous false belief that Pluto is purple. Like, that's fine. It's never really going to matter. But some of my beliefs might not be so innocuous. So you might think of them as kind of a warning light, like, don't act on that one, right? Don't place any bets on this one being true, right? So that can be really problematic for you as you're kind of trying to navigate the world. So that's a quite nice way of thinking about it. Whereas the practical rationality, it's already too late. You've already failed to go to bed, right? So the car's already leaking.
Yeah. And then what is the difference between, you talk about structural and substantive rationality? Where does that break down?
Yeah, this is quite a technical distinction that I hadn't really thought about in those terms before I came across it. So bear with me. But the headline is that structural rationality relates to the combination of your attitudes. And it's something that somebody could diagnose without knowing the contents of those attitudes. Whereas substantive rationality has to do with the broader picture, right? So philosophers like to denote propositions or the contents of beliefs, right? So I might label your belief that grass is green as the belief that pee. I might also label your belief that dogs are made of cucumber as the belief that pee. So if I'm told that you believe that pee, I don't really have anything to go on with respect to whether your belief is irrational. I need to know what that P stands for. But if I'm told that you believe that P and you believe that not P, I don't need to know what P stands for, right? I already know you've made a mistake. You're in an irrational state of mind because P and not P are not consistent, whatever P stands for, right? It could be dogs and cucumbers. It could be grass being green. So one of the rationality constraints on belief is that one's beliefs are consistent. So that would be a case of structural rationality. Doesn't matter what it stands for, you've made an error. But substantive rationality requires more information, right? So P might be grass is green or dogs are made of cucumber. And if I'm asked to say whether your belief that P is rational or not, I don't know, right? Because if it is, it doesn't arise from the structure of your attitudes, it arises from the content.
From the substance, yes. Right. Okay, yes, that's exactly. Very helpful. Thank you. I want to be respectful of your time, and I really appreciate you walking through this with me today. As we kind of come to a conclusion here, what is some everyday common advice you can give about our own irrationality? not necessarily, it kind of sounds like, trying to avoid the reps on irrationality, right? Like,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
what is some everyday advice you can give about rationality?
I guess something we said at the beginning, which is that it's really worth guarding against ever thinking of yourself as an exception. Like, it's really tempting to think, I would never believe that. I would always respond to the evidence. So it's really tempting to think that you'd never be as careless as kind of Fred the businessman in the book, or you'd never believe a conspiracy theory, or you'd never talk yourself into believing that your partner's faithful when she clearly isn't, or you'd never become delusional, or you'd never have implicit biases and so on. Because, once you look under the hood and look at the mechanics of these, I just think that we're all vulnerable to having these kinds of attitudes depending on the circumstances. And I guess more generally, I would really just express some slightly earnest comments that I had at the end of the book. This is slightly cringe, but, I think we should recogniise that things are just really complicated. And you just shouldn't think that once you've judged something as irrational, you just put it in the bin. Because it's really difficult to be sure that something's irrational. And even if we are sure, it's quite difficult to say why it's irrational, what's going on, what we should do about it. So we're much more complicated creatures than the language of irrationality can properly do justice to. Right?
Yeah, that's a beautiful and gracious answer. Dr. Sullivan-Bissett, it's been an absolute joy having you on today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.